There are women the world weighs with its eyes before it ever hears them speak, and the town of Ash Fork had been weighing Bess Kettleman that way for 37 years the morning the big bay and roan wagon team broke loose at the spring stock sale. It happened the way such things always happen, all at once and with no warning at all. A ram wether jumped the top rail of the sorting pen, and a boy went in after it, and behind the boy the tied-off team took fright at the clatter and set back hard against the hitch rail, and the rail cracked green down its length and let go, and then there were 2,000 pounds of panicked horseflesh coming around loose in a yard full of penned sheep and slow-moving men. And the boy, Dorcas Finn's grandson, 9 years old and light as a lath, went down in the churn of it directly under the wheel. And Bess Kettleman, heavy-set and broad through the shoulder, built low and wide and heavy the way the county had spent a lifetime deciding was good for nothing but relief work and sheer pen labor, was the only living soul in that yard who did not freeze. She did not shout. She stepped in. She got a hand on the near horse's cheek strap and set her whole broad weight against the swing of it, planted like a fence post driven to bedrock. And where 3 men would have been dragged, she simply did not move. And the team, feeling the one still thing in all that motion, gentled against her the way a scared animal will gentle against the only calm it can find. And she reached down with her free hand and took the boy by the back of his coat and lifted him clear the way another woman might lift a bucket, and set him on his feet, and stood there in the settling dust holding a ton of trembling horse, quiet with one hand and steadying a shaking child with the other, while every man in Ash Fork stood exactly where the noise had left him. If this story moves you, subscribe to this channel and stay with me to the very last word, and drop the name of your town in the comments below, because I want to see just how far Bess's story travels tonight. Now let me take you back, because to understand why the whole county laughed at what Bess Kettleman did that spring, you have to understand the plateau and the doomed flock she was about to spend every dollar she owned to buy. High above Ash Fork, past the last of the cottonwood bottoms where the wagon road switched back and climbed, and the air went thin and cold and smelled of sage and old snow, lay Culloden Bench, a plateau so high and wind-scoured that the grass grew sideways, bending north where the winter gales had been pushing it since before any white man put a fence on it. It was beautiful country, and it was hard country, and the two were the same thing. Spring water came up cold and clean out of Dry Sage Creek at the head of the bench, and ran down through grass that, rested and tended, could carry sheep through a winter that killed everything below it. But it had not been rested, and it had not been tended, not for 2 years, and the flock that grazed it was dying. They were dying of foot rot, first of all, the whole band gone tender and limping, standing on their knees to graze, because their feet had gone to stinking ruin in ground trodden to muck around the water, and they were dying of worms, wormy and gaunt on pasture grazed too hard too long, the grass eaten to the crown and the parasites thick in it, and the last year's clip, the wool that was supposed to have carried the place, had been ruined outright by a shearing done cold and hurried and wrong, chilled sheep shorn in a bad week, so the fleece came off ragged and second cut and stained. Grease wool that graded down to nothing at the spur. A flock is a living inheritance. It takes a lifetime to build the bloodlines and a single bad season to lose them, and Culloden Bench was losing everything at once, and the man who owned it had stopped being able to look at it. Silas Rourke was near 40 and raw-boned and worn down past the point where a man has words left in him. He had lost his wife Eleanor 2 winters back, and after her the place had begun to slide, and grief and debt had come on together the way they do, feeding each other, and now he owed the bank in Ash Fork more than the ground was worth, and the note was called, and he had put out the word, quiet and ashamed, that the band was for sale. The whole failing flock to go at the rail spur for whatever pennies the wool buyer would give for dying sheep, sold off in pieces to men who would run them into the ground the rest of the way. There was a boy up there, too, though almost nobody in town remembered it. Wren Rourke was 8 years old, and he had not said a single word since his mother died, not one, in 2 full winters. He moved around the shearing shed and the pens like a small, silent shadow, and the men who came up to look at the sale flock looked past him the way they looked past everything on that place they had already decided was finished. And down in Ash Fork, Bess Kettleman was a widow too, though the town never once thought to set the two of them side by side, because the town could not imagine what a heavy shear-hand widow and a proud grieving shepherd could ever have to say to one another. Her husband had been Tobias Kettleman, Toby, a wool hauler, a good-natured, big-handed man who freighted the clip down off the high stations to the spur, and 3 winters back his loaded wagon had gone off the Ash Fork grade on black ice, off the shoulder and down. And that had been the end of Toby. He had left her a little house at the edge of town, and $1,100 in a tin behind the stove that he had saved a hard dollar at a time and never got to spend, and one thing more that the town did not know the worth of because the town had never seen her use it: a battered wooden caddy of shearing blades and hoof knives and combs that had belonged to her grandmother, Gran Mab Kettleman. Gran Mab had been a shepherdess back in the old country and then in these hills, a legend among the few who'd known her. A woman who could read a sheep with her hands in the dark, who knew wool grease and staple and crimp the way other people knew their own children, who could tell you a ewe's bloodline by the feel of the fleece over her ribs and pare a foundered hoof back to sound in the timut. Took another hand to catch the animal, and Gran Mab had poured all of it into Bess. Every winter of Bess's childhood, the whole deep body of it that the old woman called simply the knowing. And then Gran Mab had died, and Bess had grown up into a woman the size she was in a town that had exactly one use for a woman that size. And in 37 years she had never once been let to spend the knowing on a flock of her own. She sheared for other men in the season, and the rest of the year she pulled relief work, hauling water and washing and whatever the town would pay a strong back to do, and she kept her mouth shut and her eyes open, and she carried inside her, folded up small, and never opened, the whole of what her grandmother had given her, waiting, though she had near stopped believing there would ever be anything to wait for. She was at the feed counter in Dorcas Finn's Mercantile the afternoon she heard, come in for a sack of cracked corn and standing quiet by the barrels the way she always stood, big and still and easy to talk past, while 2 of the salemen leaned on the counter and talked over her head about the Rourke flock going at the spur. "Too far gone to save," one of them said, and he said it the way men say a thing that has already been decided, comfortable in it, foot rot through the whole band, wormy as a old dog, and that clip last year not worth the sacking. "Rourke's finished," the other one said. "Whole place is dead on its feet." Bess Kettleman had heard that sentence her whole life, too far gone to save. She had heard it said about ewes she had later pared sound with her own 2 hands, and about a lame team horse she had brought back, and in 100 quiet, unkind ways she had heard it said about herself. She stood at the barrels, and she did not say anything, and Dorcas Finn behind the counter caught her eye for just a moment, and something passed between the 2 women that neither of them named. And Bess did the arithmetic. She did it standing right there, slow and careful, the way Gran Mab had taught her to do everything, a dying flock going for pennies, foot rot that a bluestone bath and a paring knife could stop, worms that a proper drench would clear, an overgrazed flat when there was rested spring grass at the head of the bench going to waste, a ruined clip-off sheep that could be reassured right come next season, and $1,100 in a tin behind her stove that Toby had saved and never spent. Most people in Ash Fork, hearing Too Far Gone, heard the end of a thing. Bess Kettleman, with her grandmother's hands and her grandmother's knowing folded up unused inside her, heard something nobody else in that store could hear. She heard a chance. She did not say a word to the salemen. She bought her cracked corn, and she nodded to Dorcas, and she went home and got the tin out from behind the stove and counted it, though she already knew the sum. And she hitched her own old horse and drove up the switchbacks to Culloden Bench in the long light of the afternoon, up out of the cottonwoods and into the thin, cold air where the grass grew sideways, and she saw the place for the first time. And it near broke her heart with how beautiful it was and how it was dying. The shearing shed stood gray and weathered against a sky gone gold at the edges, and the pens below it, and the band scattered thin across the poached flat, gaunt and limping, standing on their knees to graze, and above it all, up at the head, the dark green line of rested grass along Dry Sage Creek that no starving sheep had been led up onto. Good ground going to waste while the flock foundered on ruined ground below it, and Bess saw the whole wrong of it in one look. The way you see a wound. Silas Rourke came out of the shed as she pulled up, and stood and looked at her, and did not say anything for a while. He was worn down to the bone and past caring what came up his road. He knew who she was, the big Kettleman widow, the sheer hand, and she watched him try to fit her being here into some shape that made sense and failed to. "If you've come about the band," he said finally, and his voice was flat and empty, not unkind, just emptied out, "I'll tell you straight so you don't waste your drive. There's foot rot in the whole flock. There's worm. Last year's clip graded to nothing, and this year's won't be better. There's a man be a fool to give me a fair price, and I've stopped expecting one." He said it plain, the whole brutal truth of his ruin laid out flat for a stranger, and he did not mock her, and he did not soften it, and something in that he told her the truth instead of laughing, told Bess more about the man than any kind word could have. She did not argue with him. She had learned long ago that you do not answer a thing like that with words. She got down off the wagon, heavy and unhurried, and she looked out over the limping band a moment, and then she said the only thing she had come to say. "Let me look at one," she said. He blinked at her. "Look at one. One sheep." And there was something in how she said it, not a buyer's question, but a shepherd's, that made him turn without another word and walk down to the pen. And Bess followed, and the boy Wren came to the door of the shed and stood in the shadow of it and watched, silent, the way he watched everything. Silas caught up an old ewe and set her, and Bess went down on one knee in the muck the way her size was supposed to make impossible, easy and sure, and put her hands on the animal. And her hands remembered before her head did. She ran her palm over the ribs and felt through the ruined dirty fleece to the crimp underneath, the tight even wave of it down deep near the skin where the ruin of the shearing hadn't reached, and she went still. "This is a good ewe," she said, low, more to the sheep than to the man. "Old, but this is a good ewe under all this. This crimp, this is old blood. This is imported blood." And she looked up at Silas. "This is off the line your people brought in. This isn't a range ewe. Somebody paid dear for this line a long time back." Silas Rourke had gone very still above her. "My wife's grandfather brought that line over," he said, and his voice had changed. "Thistle, that ew's called Thistle. She's the last of them." Bess nodded like that was the most natural thing in the world, and she did not remark on it, and she ran her hand down the ew's leg to the near hind foot and lifted it, and looked at the rot in it, black and stinking, and clicked her tongue softly. "May I?" she said, and it was not really a question. And she reached back to her wagon and got Grandmab's caddy and took out a hoof knife worn thin with 50 years of use. And there in the failing gold light, kneeling in the muck with a dying ew's foot in her lap, she pared. Steady and unhurried, she cut the rot away in clean curls, following the sound horn, opening the black pocket of it to the air, paring down to where the tissue went pink and healthy again, talking low to the ewe the whole while, and the animal that had been fighting Silas's grip stood quiet for her, stood on the knee she'd left free, and let the big woman work. And when she set the foot down, the ewe put weight on it, gingerly, and stood on it, sound to the air for the first time in a season. And Bess wiped the knife on her skirt and looked up, and there was wool grease shining on her hands. Lanolin worked dark into the creases of her knuckles, the honest mark of it, and she said, "Bluestone Bath'll take the rest of it, the whole band, in 3 weeks. Worm's a drench. That clip can be shorn right next year, and you've got rested grass up top going to waste while they starve on the flat." She stood, heavy and certain, and brushed off her knee. "I've got $1,100, mister, Rourke. I'll buy the band off you outright at a fair price, fairer than the spur'll give you. And I'll lease the ground and the shed, and I'll run it." Myself, Silas Rourke, looked at her for a long moment, and there was something working in his face. Some old door that grief had shut being tested from the outside for the first time in 2 winters. And up in the shadow of the shed the boy Wren had come forward a half step without seeming to know he'd done it, watching the big woman who had made old Thistle stand. Whatever moved in Silas, he did not let it all the way loose. "I have to think," he said at last. And that was all, but he said it like a man who had a reason to think now, where an hour ago he'd had none. Bess Kettleman nodded, because a shepherd doesn't rush another shepherd, and she gathered up Grandmab's caddy and climbed back onto her wagon, and drove down off the bench in the last of the gold light with wool grease still dark on her hands and something in her chest that she had not let herself feel in a long, long time, the want of it, sharp and clean, a flock of her own, a place to spend the knowing, a life that let her be exactly the thing she was instead of paying her to be small. And by the next afternoon the town knew. That was how towns were. Dorcas Finn heard it and stood behind her counter with her lips pressed thin, but the men at the feed store heard it too, and they did with it what Ash Fork always did. The fat Kettleman widow, they said, and they slapped the counter and laughed. Went and offered to buy Rourke's dead flock, every foot-rotted worm-gutted head of it. Going to run Culloden Bench herself, they said, that one, and they laughed the way men laugh at a thing they are certain about, at a woman they had weighed with their eyes 37 years ago and filed away as too soft and too large to run anything at all, laughed the way the whole county would go right on laughing, all the long, cold way to the killing winter that was coming for them, when the white came down out of the north on the sideways grass, and they would learn, every last one of them, exactly what the woman they were laughing at was made of. Percival Drake was a narrow man with clean hands and a way of not looking straight at a woman who owed him nothing yet, and when Bess sat down across the ledger from him in the little board bank at Ash Fork, he made her wait while he squared a stack of papers that were already square. She had brought the $1,100 of Toby's savings folded into a flour sack and a listening she had learned from Grandmab, which was to say nothing until the other party had said all of it. Drake said the words he had been building all morning. A dead flock on a failing bench was not collateral a prudent bank could set much store by. The ground was leased, not owned, so it could not be signed against. A woman alone, and one who had pulled county relief work 2 winters running, was not what the directors called a going concern. He offered her a 2-year note at a rate that would have made an honest man cough, secured against the flock itself and against her tools, and he said it in the tone of a man doing a soft-headed creature a kindness she would not understand until it ruined her. Bess signed it. She did not argue the rate. She had done the arithmetic on the drive down and again by lamplight and once more waiting on his squared papers, and she knew a thing Drake did not, which was what a properly handled band of sheep on rested grass was worth against what it cost to keep them, and she knew that the whole trick of it was to make the first note and make it on the day it fell due, because a banker's contempt was only a wall until you walked through it once, and then it was a door. She took her copy, put it in the flour sack where the money had been, and drove back up the grade to the bench, and behind her Drake watched from his window with the look of a man who has bet on the sure thing and cannot say why it sits so poorly in him. She moved into the herder's shack that same week, and it was a poor thing, a single room with a stovepipe and a rope bed and a window gone milky with old grease and older weather, and Bess did not sit down in it to grieve its poverty the way another might have. She swept it. She scrubbed the one window with vinegar and sand until the plateau came back through it, all that high sideways scoured grass gone gold in the late light, and she hung Grandmab's caddy of blades on a nail by the door where she could see them, and she started where her grandmother had always started, which was not by buying anything and not by driving anywhere, but by cleaning and by healing, because Grandmab used to say, a woman who begins a sick flock by spending money instead of sweat has already lost, for the money runs out and the sweat does not. So Bess began with the feet. Foot rot had gone through the Culloden band like a bad rumor through a small town, and half the flock walked as if the ground hurt them, ewes kneeling to graze on their front pasterns because the pain had gone up into the hoof, and Silas had told her the truth of it that first day the way a man reads a debt aloud, flatly, so it cannot grow in the dark. Bess built a race of hurdles down by Dry Sage Creek and a shallow trough at the end of it, and she mixed a bluestone bath the old way, the blue vitriol dissolved careful in creek water warmed on the stove and hauled bucket by bucket, and she ran the band through it slow. No dogs pushing, no shouting. Just her body in the gap where a sheep wants to bolt, that broad back and those planted feet that the men down in Ash Fork had made their joke, being now the one still thing a frightened ewe would trust to walk toward. And before the bath, the pairing. She sat each bad one on its rump against her knees the way Grandmab had taught her before she was 10, tucked and calm with its own weight holding it, and she took the hoof knife and pared away the rotted horn, cutting down to where the black gave over to clean white, opening the pocket where the rot had gone in so the air and the bluestone could reach it, and she did it without a slip and without cutting the quick, hundreds of times, morning into dusk, until the wool grease and the creek water and the sick sweet smell of foot rot were worked so deep into her hands that she stopped smelling them, which is the shepherd's baptism and always has been. Most hands would have quit at the second day of it. Bess did not. She drenched them, too, worming the whole band against the pasture worms that had thinned them to rack and hide, dosing each ewe off a horn drench she'd cut and boiled, patient, one throat at a time, and she wormed her way through the flock the same way she had paired it, without hurry and without a single beast the worse for her handling. And when the feet were mending and the worms were falling, and the sheep began, small day by small day, to walk sound and graze standing, she did the thing that was the whole of Grandmab's knowing in one act, which was to take the band off the ground that was killing them. The flat by the old fold had been grazed to the dirt and grazed again, and fouled with 2 winters of their own dying, poisoned in the way tired ground gets poisoned, so that the more they ate of it the sicker they got, and Silas had kept them there because a grieving man keeps things where they have always been. Bess moved them up. She opened the high spring-fed grass along Dry Sage Creek that had been wrested by neglect into the best feed on the plateau, tall, crimped bunch grass that the flat had not seen in years, and she did not turn them loose in it to founder either. She gave them a fresh strip of it each day and hurdled them off what they'd cropped, letting the grazed ground rest and green behind them while the band walked forward into clean feed every morning, tight-folded and tight-guarded every night, which was nothing but the common sense her grandmother had run bands by in the old country and which the agricultural college men down the line had lately started calling rotational grazing in their pamphlets as though they had thought of it. And Bess would have laughed at that if laughing came easy to her that season, because there was nothing in it but letting the grass rest and moving the sheep and paying attention, which is to say there was everything in it. The band came back to itself on that grass. You could watch it happen if you knew what you were watching, the top line filling, the eye brightening, the new wool starting up clean, and even from the skin the way good wool does when the animal underneath it has stopped fighting to live and started only living. And it was into the middle of that, a cold bright morning 3 weeks in, that old Angus McQuaid drove up the bench road on a mule cart with his hat pulled down against being seen coming. He was past 70 and grizzled to the color of weathered fence rail, and he had herded Culloden ground for 30 years and quit the day the station started dying because, he said later, he could not stand at a graveside every morning and call it work. He did not knock, and he did not hail her. He got down off the cart, and he walked the race and the trough with his hands behind his back, and he lifted a ewe's foot without asking, and turned it to the light and set it down, and he lifted another, and he stood a long while at the edge of the rested grass, watching the band graze forward across their fresh strip with the old hurdles bright behind them, and Bess led him. She had learned from Grandmab that a man reading your work is paying you the only compliment his kind knows how to pay, and you do not interrupt it. When Angus finally spoke, he did not look at her. Whoever paired these feet, he said, learned it off somebody knew what they were about. Nobody's cut a Culloden hoof this clean since Mab Kettleman worked this ground the year I was a boy. And Bess said, she was my grandmother. And the old man turned and looked at her then, at all of her, the size of her that the town made its joke, and the wool grease worked black into the creases of her hands, and something moved through his weathered face that was not the town's look at all. "Aye," he said. "You've got Mab's hands." Then he was quiet a moment, and his jaw worked, and the grudging came back into him. "Mab's hands," he said, "but not Mab's sense, to go and buy Rourke's dying mess and put your own name against it. There's not a man in this county would have give ye a nickel for what stood on this bench a month gone." And Bess said, "There's not a man in this county pared these feet." Angus looked at her a while longer. Then he took his coat off, the old canvas herder's coat, gone the color of the ground he'd worked, and he walked to the shack and hung it on the peg beside her grandmother's blades as though he had never taken it down, and he said, "Where do ye want me starting?" And that was the whole of it, and it was everything. Because in that old man's head lived the bloodlines of the band, 40 years of which you threw good twins, and which line went back to Mab's imported stock, and which ram had thrown the crimp that made Culloden wool worth the name. And none of it written anywhere but behind his eyes. And now it was hers to draw on the way she drew on her grandmother's, two old herders' memories meeting in her hands across the years. And Silas Rourke came down. He had meant to walk off the bench and leave it to the fat widow and her folly. Everyone knew that. He had said as much at the sale, and a man who has buried a wife and is burying a life's work has the right to walk away, and no one begrudges it. But he could not. He came down at dawn the third morning after Angus stayed, walking out of the gray with a crook in his hand, and Shep the black and tan pacing quiet at his heel. And he did not announce himself or ask leave or say what he decided. He simply took the far side of the band and worked it, gathering the drift end while Bess and Angus held the lead. And he was there again the next dawn and the next. And in that way, without a word passing, that named it. The three of them settled into a working rhythm that ran on nothing but the sheep and the light. Bess did not press him. She had a shepherd's patience for a thing that would come in its own season or not at all, and she treated the man exactly as she treated a frightened ewe in the race, which was to leave the gap open and stand still in it and let him walk toward her only as far as he would that day, and no farther. His grief was a closed door, and she did not knock on it. She only kept the fire lit on her side of it and went about her work. And through the shed slats, in the long shadows, the boy watched. Ren Rourke was 8 years old and had not spoken since his mother Eleanor died 2 winters gone. Not one word to his father, nor to the schoolmistress, nor to any living soul, and Ash Fork had long since folded him into the sad shape of things it had decided could not be helped, some things being too far gone to save. He drifted at the edges where the lambs were. Bess saw it and said nothing and made no move toward the child, because you do not walk up on a wild thing, you make the place around it safe and wait. And the place around Wren that spring was warm with newborn lambs coming, for Bess had bred the band the old way, and the drop was starting, and there is nothing on this earth so made to open a shut heart as a lamb. She let him be near them. She set the orphan and the chilled ones near where the boy hovered, and she let her own hands teach his eyes. And when Thistle threw twins, and had milk for only the one, and the other lay cold and slack in the straw, its lungs barely stirring, Bess did not carry it off to save it herself. Thistle was the last of Grand Mab's imported bloodline, the best old ewe in the band, and her weak twin was the finest bred lamb on the bench, and Bess picked it up and warmed it against the stove, and squeezed the first yellow colostrum into a bottle, and then she carried the lamb and the bottle to where the boy stood, and she knelt down to his size, which for a woman built as she was built was its own long slow motion, and she held the lamb out and said only, "He'll want feeding every hour or he'll not see morning. Angus and me can't be 2 places. Will you take him?" And the boy looked at the lamb and at the bottle, and at the big quiet woman, offering it as plain as if he were any other hand, no pity in her face, and no expecting, and he took it. He took the lamb into his lap in the straw, and he got the teat to its mouth the way he'd watched her do it. And the lamb pulled, weak and then stronger, and its tail started to work, and the boy leaned down over it with his whole small self, and Bess stayed kneeling near, close but not touching, the way you stay near a thing that is deciding whether to live. And after a long while, so quiet she thought at first the wind had made it, the boy said, "He's warm now." 3 words, into the lamb's neck, not to her, hardly to anyone. The first words the child had spoken in 2 winters. Bess did not seize on it. She did not call out or weep or fetch his father running, all of which would have slammed the door the town had left ajar. She only nodded, the way she'd nod to Angus over a good foot, and she said, "That's the worst of it past, then. You'll name him what you like." And she got up slow and went back to her work and left the boy and the lamb alone with their warmth, and that was the wisdom of it, to let the small door swing on its own hinge and not grab at it. But she caught, as she turned, that Silas had gone still at the shed door with the crook forgotten in his hand, and something in his jaw had let go, some clench that had been set there 2 winters, and he turned away before she could see more of it and went out to the fence, and Bess let him go. That night a coyote worked the rimrock, and the band bunched and trembled. And the next night it was worse. 2 of them off the high rock calling to draw the ewes out, and old Shep put himself between the flock and the dark, and stood the whole night on the edge of the fold with his hackles up, a low sound going in him that never once broke into barking, because a good sheepdog knows that panic in his own throat becomes panic in the band. And in the gray morning there were tracks in the soft ground by the creek, big splayed tracks, not alone coyotes, a pair off the rimrock that had come down to look, and Bess read them and said nothing to alarm the boy, but she moved the fold tighter to the shed, and she and Angus took the nights in turn after that, and Shep took every night. Because that is dog work, and the black and tan would not be argued out of it. And then came the shearing, and that was the first true test of the whole gamble, because it was the ruined clip that had broken Silas. The year before some hurried hand had shorn the band cold and wet and hacked it into a fleece full of second cuts and stains and short broken staple. And the commission house had graded it near to worthless, and that grade was the stone that had started the whole slide down. Bess sheared it herself. She took down Grandmab's blades from the peg, the hand shears with the bows worn smooth to her grandmother's grip, and now to hers, honed on the old stone until they'd part a hair. And she sheared the band the way it is meant to be done, and almost never is any more, one long, unhurried stroke laid against the last, the blades kept flat to the skin, so the fleece came off in one whole piece, with the staple full length, and no second cuts shortening it, working with the animal's own turning instead of against it, so the ewe sat quiet in her lap, and the wool peeled away clean too. The pink hide, and she did not race it, though a man could shear 4 to her one going fast, because Grandmab had told her that speed is what the man gets paid for, and quality is what the wool remembers, and the wool always remembers. She skirted each fleece on the table herself, throwing out the dung locks and the stain, rolling the good clip-flesh side out the old careful way. And she pressed it into the wool sacks clean, and when the first sacks were done she took a fleece down to the grader, who worked the Ash Fork spur before the buyers came, a fair man in his measuring, even where his masters were not, and he opened it on his bench, and pulled the staple to the light, and put his loop to the crimp, that fine even wave that runs through good wool like the record of a life lived even, and he stood up straight and looked at her. "Where'd this come off?" he said. And Bess said, "Culloden bench." And the grader said, "Culloden's clip was rubbish last year. This," and he pulled the staple again to be sure of it, "this is the best staple and the truest crimp I've handled on this plateau in 10 years. What in the world happened up there?" And Bess said, "Somebody handled it right," and gathered her fleece and went, because she had learned long ago not to spend on a man's astonishment the words better kept for the ledger. She took the clip to market herself, graded and sacked on her own terms, and she carried the price of it down the grade to Ash Fork, and she walked into Percival Drake's board bank on the very day the first note fell due. Not a day early to seem anxious, and not an hour late, and she counted it out onto his squared papers. The whole first payment. Principal and that coughing rate of interest and all, in full. Drake looked at the money and then at the woman, and his narrow face did a thing it was not built for, which was to be surprised, and his eyebrows went up before he could stop them, and he made a small sound and pulled the money toward him and marked the note paid and stamped it, and he said, in a voice gone careful in a way it had not been careful before, "That's a clean payment, missus." Kettleman and Bess said, "There'll be another on the day," and took a receipt and left him sitting, with his contempt gone soft and door-like in his hands, the wall walked through the once, the way she'd always known it would go if she made the first note and made it right. And Dorcas Finn saw her come out of the bank into the street and called across from the mercantile step, "Bess Kettleman. I hear the whole plateau's talking about your clip," and there was a warmth in it and a pride borrowed on Bess's behalf, and one or two of the men who'd laughed hardest at the sale found reason to be looking hard at their boot toes as she passed, and Bess only touched her hat to Dorcas and drove home up the grade, and if there was any triumph in her it did not show, because she was thinking already on the drop still coming, and the tight ground, and the rimrock pair. And up on the bench in the long gold of that evening she found Silas at the far fence, mending a wire that had held fine, the way a man mends a thing that does not need mending when he is working up to something in himself. And she came alongside and took the other end of the wire without being asked, and they worked it in the quiet, and after a time, looking out over the rested grass along Dry Sage Creek, and not at her. Silas said, "My father talked about this high grass like it was a person. He was quiet, and then, like it had a temper you had to know, and a memory, and it'd give back what you put into it, and not a blade more. I thought that was soft." He set the pliers down. "I thought a lot of things were soft," he said, "that turned out to be the only hard things there are," and he did not say more than that, and did not need to. And Bess did not answer it with words, but only stood beside him at the fence in the failing light, while the band grazed home across the strip toward the fold, sound-footed now and filling out, and their new wool bright. And that was the door opening the width of a hair, the first opening of it, and she had the patience to let it be exactly that much and no more. Down in the shed the boy was bedding his lamb in fresh straw and murmuring to it low, and old Angus's coat hung on the peg by Grandmab's blades where it belonged, and Shep lay along the fold line with one ear turned always to the rimrock. And Bess Kettleman looked at the whole of it in the gold going gray, and knew, the way you know a good fleece by the weight of it in your two hands, that it was not saved yet, not by a long way, but that it had chosen to live. And that a thing which has chosen to live can be brought the rest of the way home by capable hands that do not quit. And hers did not quit. And up the draw the last of the light lay down along the crimped grass grown sideways in the wind, and the shed window she'd scrubbed clean held the small lamp of it a while against the dark coming down off the high rock. A big quiet woman hears more than a loud one ever will, because the world forgets she is in the room. And by the time the ground had greened along Dry Sage Creek, and the band was fat and clean-footed on the rested high grass, Bess Kettleman had learned to be furniture that breathed. She learned it at the mercantile counter, waiting on twine and bluestone while Dorcas Finn measured out somebody else's coffee. And she learned it at the loading chute at the Ash Fork rail spur, where the small outfits brought their wool sacks in from the plateau, and she learned it best of all standing off to the side of the grading platform with her hands folded over her middle like a woman who had come to town for nothing more than sugar. Men talked in front of her. They talked the way they would in front of a stove or a hitching post, because she was too large and too soft and too much a sheer hand for them to reckon her a listener, and she let them. And she wrote down nothing where they could see her do it, and she remembered everything. What she remembered first was the grading. Harlan Voss ran the wool bench at the spur for a commission house 200 miles down the line, A neat, narrow man with ink on his cuff and a scale he was always adjusting, and he had a way of talking about a fleece that made an honest man ashamed of it. He would take up a corner of a small rancher's clip, work the staple between two fingers, hold it to the light, and shake his head slow and sorrowful, the way a doctor shakes his head over a thing too far gone. "Cotted," he would say, "yellow in the britch." "Second cuts through the shoulder." "Off sorts," he would say, and drop the grade a full class, and drop the price with it, and the small rancher who had shorn that wool with his own cold hands in March would stand there hat in fist while Voss wrote a number on a slip that would not clear his note at the bank. Bess watched him do it to Emmett Dolan, who ran 300 head up on the Rimrock and had a wife Abed and 4 children. She watched him do it to the Pruitt brothers, and to old Cy Hargrove, who had shorn sheep on that plateau for 30 years, and every time the words were the same words, cotted, tender, off, too far gone, and every time the number was low, and every time the wool went into Voss's sacks anyway because there was no other buyer within 4 days' haul, and the note was due. And Bess, folding her hands, thinking of Grandmab's blades and the crimp that had come back into the Culloden clip like a memory, knew a lie when she heard one told over a fleece. She knew good wool by feel the way she knew a lame ewe by the set of its shoulder. And there was nothing cotted about Cy Hargrove's clip, nothing tender in Emmett Dolan's staple. The grade was clean, and the price was theft, and it was the same theft told to every small man in the same words, which meant it was not accident, and it was not the market. It was a plan. She did not say so. She bought her twine. The other thing she remembered from a wagon seat and a stove side in the back pew of the church, and it was the name Thorne. Amos Thorne ran cattle on the flat below the bench, a wide, smooth man with a good coat and a soft voice, and a habit of arriving at a foreclosure the way a crow arrives at a downed calf, before the dust had settled, and looking like he had only happened by. When the Pruitts lost their quarter section, he had the paper on it inside a month. When a homesteader named Voyle gave up on the dry ground east of the creek, Thorne bought it off the bank for back taxes and never ran a single cow on it. And Bess, hauling drench water past that empty ground, understood at last what he was buying. Because the Voyle place had a spring on it, and the Pruitt place had a spring on it, and every scrap of ground Amos Thorne had gathered in 3 years had water under it or running through it, and a cattleman who has bought up all the water on a plateau owns the grass whether he holds the deed to it or not. Thorne was buying the plateau one broke shepherd at a time, and he was buying them broke, and the man who was breaking them for him stood at the wool bench at the rail spur with ink on his cuff. She put the two together on a Tuesday, sacking her own wool at the shed with Angus at the tie, and she went still with it the way she went still over a difficult berth, not alarmed, only careful. Voss cheated the grade so the small outfits could not pay their notes. The notes fell due to a bank that would foreclose. Thorne bought the foreclosed ground for its water. Voss and Thorne were not two troubles. They were one trouble with 2 hands, and the hand at the bench fed the hand on the flat, and between them they meant to have the whole high plateau of Culloden Bench and its neighbors emptied of small men inside 2 years, and the peace they wanted most, the peace Thorne's soft eyes came back to every time, was the dry Sage Creek spring, the cold, sweet, ceaseless water that had brought the Culloden band back from the dead, the water that was the whole reason her flock now carried the best fleece on the plateau. Bess did not decide anything that Tuesday. She only began, quietly, to gather. She was good at gathering. She had gathered wool and gathered lambs and gathered her own life up off the floor after Toby went off the grade, and now she gathered proof the way Grandmab had taught her to gather anything worth keeping, slowly, with clean hands, letting nothing tear. When Voss wrote Emmett Dolan a slip and dropped his grade 2 classes, Bess was near enough to read the slip over Emmett's shoulder and near enough after to say to him, low and plain, "Keep that paper, Emmett, and keep the next one, and put them in your Bible where the mice won't get them." When the Pruitts weighed their sacks on Voss's scale and the number came up light against their own count off the shed beam, Bess asked Silas to weigh a known sack of hers on that same scale on the same afternoon. A sack she had weighed true at the shed. And the spur scale read it 4 pounds shy. 4 pounds on one sack. 4 pounds skimmed off every man's clip and off no man's who ran cattle. And she wrote the true weight and the spur weight side by side on the back of a feed bill in Grandmab's slanting hand and folded it small. She got a grading sheet, too, which was harder. She got it because Cy Hargrove, sour and beaten, threw his down in the mercantile and said he was through, and Bess picked it up off the floor like it was nothing and put it in her apron, and Cy never missed it. On that sheet, in Voss's own tidy figures, was the Hargrove clip called half a grade under what Bess had felt in it with her own hand, and beside that number, initialed small in the corner where a rancher would never think to look, was a mark she came to see on every small man's sheet and on no big man's, a little agent's mark that meant she was near sure, sell down, and she kept that too. She was building something out of paper the way she had built the flock out of ruined ewes, one sound piece at a time, and she told nobody yet, not Angus and not Silas, because a thing half-built falls if you lean on it early. Then Amos Thorne came up to the bench himself, and that was the day the trouble put on its good coat and smiled at her across her own gate. He came at the tail of a fine afternoon with the grass laid over sideways in the wind and the band grazing quiet up the draw, and he sat his good horse and looked at all of it. The mended fences, the clean-footed ewes, the water running bright out of the creek, and he took his hat off to her, which no man in Ash Fork had troubled to do in 3 years. "Mrs. Kettleman," he said, "that is a handsome band of sheep. You have done a wonder up here, and I mean that. Everybody said this ground was finished. Everybody was wrong about it," she said. "And you," his soft voice went on, "easy as pouring cream, you have got a hard winter coming, and a note at the bank, and no man on the place to speak of, and I would not see a widow break herself on ground that has broken stronger backs than hers. I will give you what you paid Rourke and a little over, cash, before the snow, and you can winter in town warm instead of froze up here alone with 1,000 sheep and the wolves." He smiled the whole time he said it, and there was nothing in the words a man could call a threat, and everything under them was won. Bess looked at him a good while. She had planted her body against a bolting ram and against a shed crush that would have killed a child, and she planted it now against a soft, smiling man on a good horse, and it held the same. "The ground is not for sale," she said, "nor the flock, nor the water." That last word she said plainly, and she watched it land, watched the smile stay put, and the eyes behind it go flat and careful, and she knew then that he knew that she knew, and neither of them said another word about it, which was worse and cleaner than a quarrel. "Winter is long," he said at last, gentle as a benediction, and turned his good horse, and rode down off the bench, and Bess stood at the gate with the wind laying the grass over sideways, and did not move until he was small on the flat. That night the wolves came. She had known the Rimrock pair was working the country. Angus had cut their sign twice at the head of the draw. 2 big rangy rogues off the high rocks that had learned lambs were easier than antelope, and she had set the guard tight, jugged the near ewes, and put the black and tan dog Shep to sleep across the fold gate the way Grandmab had always done. It was the dog that woke her, not with the alarm bark, but with the low working growl that meant business, and Bess was up and out into the cold dark in her nightdress and coat with the lantern in the crook before her mind had caught her feet up, because a shepherd's body learns to be out the door ahead of her thinking. The band was bunched and roiling against the far fence, that awful low-panicked churn a flock makes when death is in among it, and Shep was a black streak on the near wing, throwing himself at something bigger than he was. And Bess did not scream, and did not run in blind. She set the lantern up on the post, where it would throw, and she went in the way she went in among any frightened animal. Big and slow and steady and talking, low steady sound out of her broad chest, easy now, easy, so, and the sheer size of her coming through the dark with the light behind her was a thing even a wolf reckoned with. There were 2 of them, and one was already among the jugged ewes, and it had old Thistledown. Bess saw the white of the ewe's flank, and the dark shape hunched over it, and she came down on it with the whole weight and length of the crook, and the whole weight and length of herself, and a voice like the crack of the shed roof. And the wolf broke off and away, and Shep drove the other one out over the low fence, and then it was just the wind and the band's terror settling and Thistledown in, the trampled straw. She was torn along the shoulder and hind, and her breath came wrong, and Bess got down in the muck in her nightclothes and put her big hands on the old ewe, the last of Grandmab's imported bloodline, the ewe she had read by feel that first ruined day, and she felt for the tear, and it was long and ugly, but it had not gone to the vitals, and she stayed there in the cold with her hands full of blood and wool grease, keeping the old ewe warm and still until Silas came up out of the dark at a dead run with a rifle, and Wren behind him, white-faced, and between them by lantern light on a bale straw bed they cleaned and closed the tear, and Thistle lived. But it had been close, closer than the wolves alone should have brought it, and in the gray morning Angus walked the fence and came back with his hat in his hand and his old face set hard, and he did not say much because he never did, but he showed her the 2 fence posts down at the head of the draw where the wire had been cut clean with a nipper, and laid down flat so the band could drift and the wolves could come in easy, cut by no wolf's tooth. And he looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said the name Thorn out loud, and neither of them had to. It was after that Bess understood she could not go on gathering paper forever, that the winter Thorn had promised her was coming for all of them, and not just for her, and that a thing she carried folded small in her apron did no good folded. And so she did the hardest thing she had ever done, harder than the ram and harder than the wolf, which was to stand up in a room full of people and speak. They gathered the small ranchers in the schoolhouse on a raw evening with the stove ticking and the windows blind with dark 30-odd men and a scatter of wives, and it was a beaten room, you could feel it. The room of men who have added up the same sum too many times and always got the same low number. Cy Hargrove said it first, said what she had heard her whole life in one shape or another, said there was no fighting Voss and no fighting the bank and no fighting a market, that a small clip was a small clip and would fetch what the buyer said it would fetch, and that a man with any sense would take Thorn's cash while it was offered and go to town before the country was too far gone to sell at all. Too far gone. The old sorrowing words, the doctor shaking his head over the fleece, and Bess felt them go through the room like cold water, and she felt herself begin to shrink into her chair the way she had shrunk her whole life, and then she did not. She thought of Grandmab's hands. She thought of Thistle breathing wrong in the straw and living anyway because somebody big had come into the dark and would not leave. She put her hands flat on her knees, wool greased and scarred and steady, and she stood up, and the whole beaten room turned to look at the fat widow who had bought a dead flock, and for one long breath nobody said a word. "It is not too far gone," Bess said. Her voice came out low and even, a working voice, a voice that had gentled 1,000 frightened animals. "I have handled every clip that man has cheated at that bench," she said, "and there is nothing wrong with your wool. Cy, your breech is clean and your staple is sound," and he called it yellow and off to your face and dropped you 2 grades, "and I have the sheet in my apron this minute in his own ink, and I have his scale reading 4 pounds shy on a sack I weighed true off my own beam. He is not grading your wool. He is grading your notes. He drops the price so you cannot pay the bank, and Amos Thorn buys the ground off the bank for the water under it, and the 2 of them mean to have every spring on this plateau and every one of you gone off it inside 2 winters, and it is not the market, and it is not bad luck, and it is not that you are too far gone. It is a plan, and a plan can be broke." She let that sit. "You cannot fight Voss," she went on, "because he is the only buyer that will come up here, and that is his whole strength, that a small clip has no place else to go. So do not fight him. Go past him. One man's clip is small, and Voss can name its price. But 30 clips graded honest and sacked clean and weighed true and shipped together down the line to an honest commission house is not a small clip. It is the biggest clip on the plateau, too big to bluff and too clean to downgrade, and a house 200 miles off that never heard Thorne's name will pay it what goodwill is worth and pay it to all of you at once. We grade it ourselves, off my beam, off the old sheets, so no man's fleece can be lied about. We sack it together, we ship it together, we sell it together, over Voss's head and past his bench, and there is not one thing he can do about it. Because he cannot cheat wool he never gets his hands on, and Thorne cannot buy ground off a bank that is being paid. 30 little clips that cannot stand alone, she said, and I have seen what a loan gets you in this country, but 30 made into one is a clip too big to cheat. The room was dead quiet. She had never in her life said so many words at once, and she felt wrung out with it, and for a moment she thought it had fallen flat, the way she had half expected, and then old Angus McQuaid, who had said nothing all night, stood up slow off the back bench with his hat in his hand, and said only, "I heard it on this plateau 40 year, and I never heard a shepherd talk better sense. And I am with the woman." And Dorcas Finn, who was not even a rancher, stood up beside the stove with her arms folded and said she would sack wool herself and keep the ledger clean, and any man who thought a woman could not run the figures was welcome to check her arithmetic, and there was a low laugh at that. The first warm sound in the room all night. Still the men sat heavy, because they were beaten men, and beaten men are slow to hope, and it might have died there. And then Cy Hargrove got up. Cy, who had said too far gone, Cy, who had once laughed loudest of all of them at the notion of the fat shear hand buying Rourke's dead sheep, stood up sour and stiff with 30 years of the plateau in his bent back, and he looked around the room, and he looked at Bess a long hard while, and he said, "I have known good wool from bad my whole life, and that woman just told me what was wrong at that bench better than I could tell it myself, and I called her clip finished last spring, and she made it the best on the plateau, and I am done being ashamed to follow somebody with better hands than mine." He set his hat back on. "I will pool my clip with hers," he said, and rode home. And the room turned then, slow, and then, all at once, the way a band turns to a steady voice. One man, and then his neighbor, and then the whole beaten roomful of them, hands going up, voices low, "We are in. We will try it. Count us." And Bess Kettleman stood at the front of the schoolhouse with her wool-greased hands folded and the stove ticking and 30 small outfits voting one by one to become. One clip too big to cheat, and outside the wind laid the plateau grass over sideways in the dark, and none of them knew yet. Not Bess, and not Cy, and not Silas standing quiet at the back with the boy, that the hardest thing the plateau had to give them was not Voss and not Thorne at all, but a sky that had not yet begun to fall. Building the pool was a mountain of ugly labor, and Bess climbed it the only way she knew, one sack at a time. There was no glory in it, and no speeches after that one night in the schoolhouse, only the grind of 30 scattered outfits learning to move as one thing when they had spent their whole lives suspicious of the man over the next fence. She rode from the Kirby's place to the Danforths to the Pruitts with a tally book on her knee and Grandmab's hand scale in a flour sack behind the cantle, and she weighed and graded and sorted and wrote it all down in a hand that did not smudge, because a pool that could not prove its own clip was worse than no pool at all. Some days she was in the saddle before the glass in the shack window went gray, and off it again long after dark, and she came in with her back locked, and her hands stiff with the cold, and the wool grease worked so deep into the creases that no lye soap on the plateau would lift it. She did not mind the grease. She had never minded it. Her whole life the town had looked at those broad hands and seen a woman built for hauling relief sacks and scrubbing other people's floors, and now those same hands were the thing 30 families were leaning their year on, and if the price of that was skin the color of old harness leather, she would pay it and be glad. Silas came with her when he could be spared from the bench, and Angus stayed back and worked the band with Wren and the dog, and between the 4 of them the thing began, slowly to Holt. Then, in the last raw week before the lambing, when the grass was just showing green in the low places and every ewe on the plateau walked heavy and slow, the pool got the vindication Bess had never asked it for. It happened at the Pruitt outfit, and it happened in front of exactly the men who most needed to see it. Cal Pruitt ran the second biggest small band on the plateau, and Cal Pruitt was the man in the schoolhouse who had sat with his arms crossed and said, right out loud, that he would not be told his business by a fat widow who had owned sheep for a season and a half. And Bess had let it pass the way she let most things pass. Because a thing you answer with your mouth, you have to keep answering. And a thing you answer with your hands stays answered. She was crossing the Pruitt Flat with a sack of grated fleece roped down behind her when she saw the knot of men out by the water gap. 3 or 4 of them, standing the particular helpless way men stand around a valuable animal that is dying, and she reined over without being asked because Gran Mab had raised her to and rode in on Cal Pruitt's prize ram down on his side in the mud. Bloated hard as a drum, his flank swelled out, and his breath coming in short, whistling heaves. He was a fine ram. A heavy-boned buck Pruitt had paid Denver money for and bred half his band to, and he had gotten into the young alfalfa on the low ground, the way a ram will, and blown himself up on it. And the men were standing there arguing over whether to send the boy 9 miles for the horse doctor who had come too late. Bess was off her horse before she had fully decided to be. She went down on her knees in the cold mud without a thought for the ruin of her one good riding skirt, put the flat of both hands on that iron-hard flank, and read it the way she read everything, by feel, and what she felt was a ram with maybe minutes left in him. Cal Pruitt said something then, some hard thing about her getting her fat hands off his ram, and she did not so much as look up. "Get me the trocar out of my off-side bag, or get me a knife and a clean reed, and do it now, because arguing is going to cost you this ram." Nobody moved for a breath. Then old Angus's grandnephew, who was one of the men standing there, went and got the bag, because he had seen what her hands could do, and Bess took Gran Mab's trocar and cannula that had lived in that caddy for 40 years and never once in Bess's life been used in front of men who mattered, found the spot high on the left flank by pressing with 2 fingers, and put it in clean and sure and steady the way you do a thing you were taught before you could read. The gas came out of that ram in a long foul rush, and the drum-tight flank went slack under her hands by inches, and the whistling breath eased and deepened, and inside 2 minutes the buck that had been dying was lying there breathing like a bellows, spent and alive. She held the cannula and kept the wound clean and talked to the ram low the whole time. The same low, steady nothing she talked to every frightened animal, and when she finally sat back on her heels in the mud, there was a silence over that water gap you could have cut and sacked. Cal Pruitt stood over her with his mouth working and nothing coming out of it. She got up, big and slow and streaked with mud to the elbow, and handed him a twist of the salve she carried, and told him plain how to nurse the buck through the next 2 days and what to keep him off of, and then she said the only sharp thing she said the whole while, and she said it kind, which made it land harder. "He'll breed you a fine crop yet. A thing that's down isn't the same as a thing that's finished. I'd have thought a man with a band this good would know that." And she got back on her horse and rode on to weigh the Danforth's clip, and behind her Cal Pruitt looked at the ram and then at the mud where she'd knelt. And the men who had laughed in the schoolhouse did not say one word, because there was nothing left to say. By nightfall it was all over the plateau that the fat widow had opened Pruitt's blown ram with a 40-year-old tool and a steady hand, and never so much as changed her breathing, and the last of the holdouts came into the pool that week, and Cal Pruitt came himself, hat in his 2 hands on her shack step, and did not apologize, because men like Cal do not, but told her his whole clip was hers to grade however she saw fit, and that was the apology, and she took it as one. So the pool was whole, and the sacks were mounting in the shearing shed graded and sewn and stenciled, and every soul on the plateau turned to the one thing left between them and the honest commission house down the line, which was the lambing, and it was the lambing that the sky had been saving its worst for all along. Bess felt it come before she saw it. She had felt weather her whole life the way some people feel a change of luck. In the old ache along the arm she'd broke as a girl, and in the particular way the band grazed, restless and bunched, and 3 days out she started reading the glass in the shack window twice a day and watching the light. The light went wrong on the second day, a hard, flat, brassy light with no warmth in it, and the wind that had blown steady out of the west for a month backed around into the north and died to nothing. And the nothing was worse than the wind. Angus came up from the band with his face set. "I don't like the smell of it," was all he said, and Angus had heard it on that plateau since before Bess was born, and when Angus did not like the smell of a sky, you moved. Bess moved. She had, all through the green week, been jugging the closest ewes early against just this, building lambing pens in the long lee of the shearing shed out of hurdles and sacking and every board on the place, and now she and Silas and Angus and Wren and the dog Shep worked from before light straight through, sorting the band by how near their time was and crowding the springing ewes and the ones. Already showing into the jugs and the shed and the old wagon sheds, packing them close for their own warmth, throwing down every armful of hay on the place for bedding. Because a wet newborn lamb on cold bare ground in a north wind is a dead lamb inside the hour, and she meant to give the storm as little to kill as she could. They worked until the first flakes came, and the first flakes came sideways. Then the white came down out of that brassy sky all at once, the way a killing spring blizzard comes on the high plains, no soft beginning to it, just a wall of driving snow so thick that the shed door vanished from 30 feet and the wind screaming out of the north hard enough to lean on, and the temperature falling like a stone down a well, and it was the exact worst hour it could have come, dead in the heart of the lambing, with half the band still to drop, and the ewes going into their time out in the white, because a ew's time comes when it comes, and no storm ever taught one to wait. This was the night the whole plateau had dreaded, and no man on it would have chosen to be out in, and Bess Kettleman put on Toby's old sheepskin coat that no other coat in Ash Fork would have gone around her shoulders, and went out into it. She went out into the thing the whole county had bolted its doors against, and she used every ounce of the size and the strength and the weight that the town of Ash Fork had spent 37 years calling too much, too soft, too big to be any use to anybody. She broke a path through the drifting snow to the far jugs where 150 pounds less of a woman would have foundered. And the wind that staggered Silas she leaned into and stood up in, and where the men had to stop and catch their breath she kept going, because the one thing the plateau had never understood about a broad-backed woman built like Bess was that the same body that could not be made pretty could not be knocked down either. She found the ewes dropping their lambs into the driving white and freezing them where they lay, and she did the only thing there was to do, which was to gather up each wet newborn lamb the instant it came, and open her coat and put it against her own body, against the warmth of that broad chest the town had mocked, and button the sheepskin over it and carry it in out of the killing wind to the shed, and go back out for the next. She carried them 2 and 3 at a time inside her coat, small and blue and barely breathing, and the heat of her own big body was the thing that kept the life in them across those 40 freezing feet, and there was not a slim woman nor a slight man on that plateau who could have done what her size let her do that night. In the lantern light of the shed she worked over the ones that came in blue, and still, the ones any man would have thrown on the bone pile, and she brought them back with the old shepherd's tricks Gran Mab had put in her hands before she could spell, rubbing the wet lamb hard against the grain with a twist of dry sacking to wake the blood, breathing warm into the little cold mouth, holding it down close to the stove where the barrel of half-froze ones lay in a nest of hay, and when a lamb was too far gone and too weak to suck, she warmed the ewe's colostrum and ran the little tube down its throat the careful old way, and got the warm strength of it straight into the belly, and one by one the blue lambs pinked and stirred and lifted their heads and cried. And every cry was a life the storm had come 900 miles to take and not gotten. She did not scream, and she did not weep, and she did not stop. She moved through that shed study as a millstone, big and slow and certain, and her steadiness was the thing that held the whole night together. Because a lambing shed in a blizzard runs on nerve, and hers did not break. Silas worked beside her without a word between them beyond what the work needed, catching lambs, carrying, holding lanterns against the wind that clawed at the shed, and Wren, the boy who had not spoken above a whisper to anyone but Bess and the lambs since his mother died 2 winters gone. Wren was in the thick of it, small and quick, where the grown ones were slow. Crawling into the low jugs the men could not fit, carrying dry sacking, doing the work of a hand twice his years, and nobody had told him to, and nobody could have stopped him. Deep in the worst of the night, when the storm had settled into the long roaring middle of itself and Bess had lost count of the hours, old Thistle went into her time. Thistle, the last of Grand Mab's imported bloodline, the old ewe Bess had read by feel that first ruined day and pared and carried through, was down in the corner jug carrying twins and carrying them hard. And the first lamb came wrong, a leg turned back, and there is no time in the world for a lamb turned wrong. In a ewe old Thistle's age and cold like that, Bess went down in the straw beside her and got her broad hand in, gentle and slow against every screaming instinct to hurry, and found the turned leg by feel in the dark warm dark, and eased it around, and brought the first lamb into the world into her own 2 hands, and it came slack and blue and not breathing. She swung it and rubbed it and breathed into it, and it did not answer. And it was Wren who was on his knees in the straw across the lamb from her, Wren with his small hands already reaching, and Bess looked at the boy across that still blue lamb and said, "Lo, rub him, Wren, hard, like I showed you. Don't you stop." And the boy rubbed that lamb with everything in him, his whole small body into it, and Bess got the tube warm and ready, and the second twin came behind, the first easier, and lived and cried straight off. And it was the crying of the living twin, maybe. Or it was the boy's hard small hands, or it was the warm colostrum Bess ran down its throat. But the blue lamb in Wren's arms shuddered all at once, and drew a breath, and coughed and cried. And Wren Rourke, 8 years old, who had not said a full clear word to the wide world since the night his mother left it, held that lamb up against his chest the way Bess held them against hers, and said, out loud, plain and whole and steady, in a voice that stopped Silas Rourke dead in the shed door with a lantern in his hand, "His name is Storm." That was all. His name is Storm. 3 words, said over a lamb the blizzard had tried to take and not gotten, and nobody made anything of it, because to make anything of it would have broken it, and Bess only nodded like it was the most ordinary thing in the world for a boy to name a lamb, and said, "Storm it is." Good strong name for a lamb born in one, and went on with her hands in the work, but she saw the lantern in Silas's hand shake, just once, and she saw something in that closed-shut face of his that she had no name for and did not reach for, and she let it be. Because some doors you do not push, you only leave your side of open. And out beyond that shed, all through that same killing night, the plateau that Bess Kettleman had spent a winter stitching into one thing was doing the thing she had built it to do without knowing she was building it. Because a big, quiet woman had spent a season teaching 30 suspicious outfits to trust 2 words from her on the party line. When Bess had gotten word down the wire before the storm sealed everything, just get to your ewes, jug them close, watch the north, the plateau had listened. And now, in the roaring dark, the small outfits were fighting the same fight in their own sheds. And more than that, they were coming. They came through the storm to each other the way no man on that plateau would have come a year before, on sledges behind laboring teams, following fence lines by hand where the road was gone, lanterns swinging in the white. The Danforth men to the Pruitt jugs, where a young hand was alone with too many ewes. Cal Pruitt himself breaking a team through the drifts to the Kirby place, and up and down Ash Fork that night there was a lamp lit in every kitchen window, and a shepherd's wife or a shepherd's. Mother bent over a dishpan by the stove with a half-froze lamb in it, warming the life back into another family's lamb crop because that was the kind of thing you did now. on this plateau. Because a woman the town had called too soft for hard business had shown them what hard business looked like when it was done for each other instead of against. Dorcas Finn kept the mercantile stove roaring all 3 nights and a pot of coffee on it, and men came in blue and stumbling off the sledges and thawed and turned around and went back out. It was 2 words on a party line and a season of earned trust, and it turned the whole county out into a storm that ought to have shut every door on the plateau. And that was the thing Bess had truly built, though she was too deep in her own shed to see it. The storm blew 3 days. 3 days and 3 nights of it, the wind never letting up long enough to hear yourself think, the snow drifting to the eaves of the low sheds, and Bess did not sleep more than a snatched hour at a time, slumped against the warm flank of a jugged ewe, and neither did Silas. And Angus took the deep hours so the younger ones could steal that hour, and Wren would not be sent to the shack to sleep, and finally slept where he dropped, in the straw with the lamb Storm tucked inside his coat the way Bess had shown him with his own 2 hands. And they held. Lamb by lamb and ewe by ewe they held, and the bone pile that every man in the county had swore would be head high by the 3rd morning stayed near empty, because a woman had jugged the band early against a glass she trusted more than the calendar, and had gone out into the white when the wind came instead of bolting the door, and had a boy and a proud man and an old herder and a black and tan dog beside her who would not quit while she did not quit. On the 3rd night the wind changed. Bess felt it before she heard it, the great roaring pressure of it easing off the shed walls, and she went to the door and put her shoulder to the drift against it and shoved it open a hand's width, and the snow had stopped, and the cold had come down hard and clean and still behind it the way it does, and through a tear in the cloud there was one hard white star. She stood in the doorway a long moment, filling it, and behind her the shed was full of the small, blunt bleating of lambs alive that had no business being alive, and she let out a breath she felt she'd been holding for 3 days. Dawn came gray and slow and exhausted over Culloden Bench, and it came on a world scoured white and blinding and utterly silent. Drifts humped up soft against every fence, and the sun not yet up, just a cold, hard promise of it along the rimrock. And Bess Kettleman walked out onto the swept ground in front of the shearing shed with Toby's coat hanging open and her hands wrecked and grease black and steady, and she looked at the band. The band stood whole. On the wind-swept ground behind the shed where the snow had scoured off to the old grass, the ewes stood in the gray light with the steam of them rising, and at every ewe's flank stood a lamb, or 2, dropped in the worst 3 days the plateau had seen in 30 years and living, hundreds of them, a lamb crop the whole county had written off standing there on its new legs in the dawn crying to be fed. And Bess stood at the center of it and counted with her eyes and could hardly credit the count. And the county came. They came up the draw in the first real light, on sledges and afoot and horseback where a horse could go, the small outfits of the whole plateau, the men who had laughed in the schoolhouse, and the men who had come through the storm to each other's sheds, come now to see the bench because word had run even through the blizzard that the bench had held, and they stood at the edge of the swept ground in the exhausted gray light, worn to the bone every one of them, and looked at the standing band and the living lambs, and did not say much, because there was not much a man could say. They looked at the flock the storm had not taken, and then they looked at her. They looked at the big, broad-backed woman standing at the center of the thing she had saved, streaked with mud and grease, and 3 days without sleep. Too soft they had called her, too large to run anything, too far gone the flock had been, and too far gone she had been to think she could save it. And there she stood in the gray dawn with the whole living lamb crop of Culloden Bench at her back, and not one man at the edge of that ground was fool enough to say any of those old words now. Cal Pruitt took his hat off. He did it slow, and he did it without a word, and one by one down the line the men took their hats off in the killing cold to a woman in the gray light, over a flock that lived, and Bess Kettleman looked back at them steady and did not smile and did not weep, only lifted her wrecked grease-black hands a little from her sides, palms out, as if to say, "Here, this is what these were always for." And somewhere behind her in the shed a boy's voice, clear now and unafraid, was calling a lamb by the name he'd given it. And up on the rimrock the first hard gold of the sun came over and lit the swept white ground and the steaming standing band all at once, and the worst was over, and the count was in, and it held. The wool came off the plateau that spring the way water finds its own level, slow at first and then all at once, and Bess Kettleman stood in the door of the Culloden Bench shed and watched the wagons come. They came up the Dry Sage Road in a line, the small outfits, the Petries and the Hollisters and the Widow Cade and old Barrett, who had once told a schoolhouse full of men that he would follow the big woman before he would follow a beef market, and every wagon that came up carried its clips sacked and tied. The grease wool of 30 little bands that could not stand alone. And Bess and Angus and Silas graded it there in the long light of the shed, where the blades still smelled of last week's work. She had learned to grade the honest way, the way Grandmab graded, by the staple and the crimp and the sound the feebry made when you drew it slow between the thumb and the ear. And there was no trick in it, and no thumb on the scale, and every man who brought a clip up watched her hands move through his wool and knew for the first time in his ranching life exactly what he had grown. That was the thing that broke the ring, though no one in Ash Fork would have called it a breaking, because a breaking sounds like a gunshot, and this sounded like nothing at all, like a ledger closing, like a wool sack drawn tight and knotted off. Harlan Voss stood on the platform at the rail spur with his grade book and his rigged weights and his commission house behind him, and he waited for the small clips to come to him hat in hand the way they always had, one at a time, each little rancher alone and desperate and easy to shave, and the small clips did not come. They went up the same road to Culloden Bench instead, and they were graded true and sacked clean and marked to the honest house down the line, the one Bess had written to over the winter in her square patient hand, and when Voss's rail cars sat empty on the siding through the whole first week of the shipping, he understood what had happened to him the way a man understands the ice going out from under a wagon, too late to matter and too slow to fight. He could not downgrade a clip he never saw. He could not lowball 30 men who had become one clip too big to cheat. One clip that arrived at the honest house graded and weighed and vouched for by a woman whose name meant something now on the plateau, and the price came back up the line a fortnight later, and it was the best price the Ash Fork country had seen in 10 years, and it was paid in full, and it was split fair. And there was not one thing Harlan Voss could do about any of it but pack his grade book and take the down train, which he did, and no one went to the platform to see him off. Amos Thorne lasted a little longer, because a man with land and water and patience always lasts a little longer, but his patience had been built on a simple arithmetic, and the arithmetic had gone wrong on him. He had counted on the small outfits going broke by the falling price, so their foreclosed ground and their spring water would come to him for pennies, one dry creek and one thin bench at a time, until the whole plateau was his and the Dry Sage Spring with it, and instead the small outfits had money in the bank at Ash Fork for the first time in years. Real money. A paid note and a paid tax and a little put by, and not one of them had to sell, and a man cannot buy a plateau off of people who are not selling. Bess never once faced him with a hard word. She never needed to. She had beaten him with a wool sack and a ledger, the way Grandmab always said, the strong, quiet things beat the loud, grasping ones in the long end, not by shouting them down, but by simply, patiently, outlasting them and outworking them until there was nothing left for them to take. Thorne rode up the bench road one last time in the good coat he wore for closings, meaning perhaps to make one final smiling offer, and he found the shed lit and full of graded wool, and the small ranchers' wagons in the yard, and the widow Kettleman at the grading table with wool grease to the elbow. And he sat his horse a long moment looking at all of it, and then he touched his hat to her, which was a thing Amos Thorne had never done to any small rancher in his life, and he turned the horse and rode back down, and that was the last of him on the plateau. Percival Drake at the bank took the final payment on the 2-year note 8 months early, counted it twice, and pushed the paper across the counter marked "Paid" in a hand that was not quite steady, and he looked at Bess over his spectacles and started to say something about how he had not, at the outset, thought, and then he stopped himself. Because there was no way to finish that sentence that did not shame him, and Bess only folded the paper and put it in the caddy with Grandmab's blades where it belonged, and said, "It was good ground, Mr. Drake. It only needed somebody to see it." And the town turned the way a flock turns, not one sheep deciding, but the whole band easing around together until it was headed a new way, and no one could say quite when it had happened. Dorcas Finn had seen the Worth from the first and said so, loud, at the mercantile counter to anyone who came in, and the once mocking men who had laughed the fall day the news went round that the fat widow had bought a dead flock, now took their hats off when she passed, and asked her opinion on a foot rot they could not clear. And out on the bench road a hand that used to stay hard on the wheel would lift an inch off it now in the plain country salute one working person gives another, and Bess lifted hers back, wool grease and all, and drove on. She did not gloat over any of it. That was not in her. She had been underestimated her whole life, and she knew the taste of it too well to enjoy handing it to another soul, even a Thorne, even a Voss, and so she took the turning of the town the way she took a good clip, quietly, gratefully, without a word wasted, and she went on with the work, because the work was the thing she had wanted all along, more than the winning, more than the being right. A flock of her own, and a place to spend the knowing, and a reason to get up in the cold dark and go out to the band. And into all that quiet turning came the last and slowest thing to turn, the thing she had not let herself want because wanting it seemed greedy on top of everything else she had been given, and it came, when it came, the way the good things always came to her, small and without warning, and almost missed. It was late in the shearing when it happened, the long clip nearly done, the shed thick with the smell of hot fleece and lanolin, and Silas Rourke stood in the wide door with the evening behind him and the whittled wooden lamb in his hand. He had carved it over the winter, Bess knew. Though she had never once seen him at it, she had only seen it growing, a rough blank on the shack table one week, a shaped thing the next, the legs come clear, the small, blunt head, the fleece cut into the pine in little curls with the point of his knife, and she had understood without being told that it was for Wren, that a grieving man carves a thing slow for a grieving boy, because his hands can say what his closed mouth cannot. But it was not to Wren. He brought it now. He stood in the door and turned it over in his fingers the way a man turns over words he has been carrying too long, and he opened his mouth, and Bess watched something in his jaw let go and then catch again, watched the door of him swing an inch and stick, and he said, "I meant to," and could not finish it. He tried again. The place. And you. I've been trying to find the way to, and there it stopped a second time. Dead. The sentence he had carried up from the shack and could not lay down, and he stood there, raw-boned and worn in the good gold light, with the little wooden lamb in his hand and 40 years of a proud man's silence sitting on his tongue. And he could not ask her the thing he had come to ask. So she answered it. She set down the shears, and she crossed the shed floor to him, unhurried, the way she crossed a pen to a frightened ewe, and she reached up and tucked a loose strand of his gray-shot hair back off his forehead with one wool-greased hand. And she left the hand there a moment against his weathered temple, and she said, "Yes, Silas, I'll stay. I was always going to stay." That was all. That was the whole of it. There was no more said, because with people like these two there did not need to be more said, and he closed the little distance that was left and took her hand down from his face and held it in both of his, the greased, hard-working hand of her, and he pressed the wooden lamb into her palm and folded her fingers over it, and they stood in the shed door in the failing light with the wool smell around them and the band bedding down out on the rested grass. Two people who had each lost the person they thought was the whole of their lives and had somehow, past all the arithmetic, been given another. And neither of them wept and neither of them spoke, and it was the truest moment either of them had known in years. Then a small voice said, from the shadow by the wool sacks where he had been all along, watching, "Are you my ma now?" And it was Wren, 8 years old, come all the way back to speech through a winter of lambs, standing there in his father's cut-down coat with his eyes very wide, and Bess turned and went down on her knees in the shed dirt so she was level with him, her broad back curving down to meet the boy, and she said, "I'd be proud to be, if you'll have me." And Wren looked at his father, and his father's jaw let go all the way this time, all the way at last, the whole closed door of him standing open in the gold light, and the boy walked over and put his hand in Bess's greased hand, the small one into the big one. And that was the family sealed. 3 people in a shed door with a wooden lamb between them, and up on the bench the real Thistle, the old ewe. The last of Grandmab's bloodline lifted her head and looked down at the light and went back to her grazing as if to say the thing was settled and had been settled a good while, and it was only the people who were slow to know it. They built toward the rest of it through that summer and the summers after, the staying on, the long, good, ordinary work that the world never makes stories of, but that is the whole of a well-lived life. The wool pool did not fold when the crisis that made it had passed, the way such things often fold. It hardened instead into a lasting thing, a cooperative with a real ledger and a real name. And the valley voted the next year to build a washing and carding room down by the spur, a long, clean building where the Plateau's clip could be scoured and carded and readied and sold up the ladder for more than grease wool ever brought, and they built it board by board through 2 falls with the money the honest Price had put in their pockets. And the small outfits that Amos Thorne had meant to swallow one by one instead grew slowly stouter side by side, and there were children on the Dry Sage Road again, on ponies, on foot, coming up to the bench to see the lambs the way children will. Where the winter Bess arrived there had been no children on that road at all. Old Angus McQuaid never did leave. He had hung his coat on the peg in the shack that first spring, and he left it there, and he grew older and slower and gruffer, and he sat in the sun by the shed door and told the bloodlines of every ewe in the band to whoever would listen, which was mostly Wren, and it was Angus and Bess together who taught the boy the knowing, the true old knowing, the feel of a good fleece, and the reading of a sick foot, and the way to gentle a frightened animal with a low voice and a still body, the knowing that had come down from Grandmab Kettleman through Bess's hands and would go down now through Wren's, unbroken, the way such things are meant to go down, hand to hand, kneeling in the dirt at the level of the young. And there is no inheritance on this earth worth more than that one, and Bess knew it and gave it whole. Thistle lived 3 more good years, and threw 2 more sets of twins, and died old and easy in the sun, and her line ran on in the band, the imported blood Grandmab had prized, safe now, secured, the best wool on the plateau, and known to be, and the crimp of it was a thing wool buyers down the whole line spoke of by name, the Culloden clip, they said, the Kettleman clip, meaning the finest, meaning worth. And so the threat that had come to break the small ranchers of the Ash Fork Plateau was ended, not with a gun and not with a shout, but with a wool sack drawn tight and a ledger kept honest and a woman's steady hands. And if you want to know how it all came out, you need only picture those hands, wool grease worked into the knuckles the way it had been worked in the day she first pared old Thistle's rotted foot, the same hands that had planted themselves in the dust at the spring stock sale and stopped a thing no man in that pen would stand in front of. The hands the whole county had once bet against because they came attached to a body it called too soft and too large for hard work, when all along that size was the very strength the plateau would one day need out in the white, where no smaller person could have carried the frozen lambs home. The grass grew sideways on Culloden Bench, wind-scoured and hardy the way it had always grown, and it fed the band, and the band came home. And here, now, at the end of it, I want to turn and say a word to you, whoever you are, wherever you are sitting in the dark tonight, with this story for company. The morning comes. It always comes. However long the winter runs, however far gone a thing looks, However many years the world spends telling you that what you are is too much or too little or too far past saving, the morning comes, and when it does, the only thing it asks of you is that you kept the knowing bright and ready through the dark. Keep your hand steady. Keep your worth whole and unbitter and unbent. Do not let the doubting of small people curdle in you. Do not let the long, cold years teach you to be less than you are. Because there will come a day, there always comes a day, when the world finally has need of exactly the thing it once mocked in you, the exact size and shape and strength of you, and on that day your hands must be ready and your knowing must be bright. And if you have kept them so, you will walk out into the white while braver-seeming folks stand frozen in the door, and you will carry home the thing that had to be carried home. So, keep it ready. That is the whole of what Bess would tell you, and it is the whole of what I have to give you tonight. Now, before you go, sit with me one moment more and tell me 2 things down in the comments, because I read them, and because I want to know how this one settled in you. Tell me which victory landed hardest, the wild night of the killing blizzard, when she went out into the snow and carried the frozen lambs against her body and led the whole county through the white, or the quieter one, the long slow staying on after, the paid note and the carding room and the boy learning the knowing at her knee, the years of ordinary work that no one makes a story of. I have my own thought on which was the greater, but I want yours first. And tell me the name of your town, wherever you are, a big city or a crossroads with a feed store and nothing else, it does not matter. Drop the name of your town down below. Because I truly do want to see just how far Bess Kettleman's story has traveled tonight, from my voice to your ear, across all that dark country between us. Stay with me, and I'll meet you up the same road next time, a little further along the Ash Fork Plateau, where there's another small outfit holding on by its fingernails and a young pair just starting out with more grit than sense and a flock nobody thinks will last the winter, and you know by now how that kind of story tends to go, up on this high ground among these stubborn, steady people. But that is for next time. For now, picture it with me one last time and then rest. Evening on Culloden Bench, the light going down long and gold across the sideways grass, the shed lit warm and yellow against the coming dark, and in the door of it 3 people, standing close, the big, stutty woman with wool grease on her hands, the raw-boned man whose door finally opened, and the boy between them who found his voice again over a chilled lamb, and up the draw, slow in the failing gold, unhurried, the low bells sounding, the dogs easing them along the fence line, the band comes home. It comes home every evening of that long and well-loved life, and she is never, from that spring on, standing in that lit door alone. The morning comes, and so, in its own good time, does the flock.